Your burger is served. And this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is the Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to the Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you in depth behind the scenes of the world of organized crime and La Cosa Nostra. Well, this is a rare treat because I have the opportunity to talk with an award-winning investigative journalist who has written a book that everybody in Mafia circles is talking about. Now, when you think of the world of organized crime, when you think of the Mafia specifically, what cities do you think about? Do you think of New York? Do you think of Chicago? Do you think of Las Vegas? Do you maybe even think of Detroit or Cleveland? Do you think of any cities in Pennsylvania? Well, thanks to the work done by Matt Birkbeck, author of the new book, The Life We Chose, we now know that one of America's most powerful mafia families wasn't based in New York, wasn't based in Las Vegas, but the person pulling the strings was actually within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The Life We Chose is all about William Big Billy D'Elia and the last secrets of America's most powerful mafia family. Now, a lot of you might remember that term, the life we chose. Certainly rang a bell with me because that's precisely what Hyman Roth told Michael Corleone in The Godfather Part 2 when he gave him a hard time about Mo Green. You remember this?
When I heard it, wasn't angry. I knew Mo. I knew he was headstrong, talking loud, saying stupid things. So when he turned up dead, I let it go. And I said to myself, this is the business we've chosen. I didn't ask who gave the order, because it had nothing to do with business. There are $2 million in a bag in your room. I'm going in to take a nap. When I wake, if the money's on the table, I'll know I have a partner. If it isn't, I'll know I don't.
It's still so great watching that incredible scene. But when you think of the most famous mafia figures in American history, you think of people like Momo Giancana, maybe Al Capone, maybe Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, maybe somebody like Vincent Gigante, John Gotti, depending on the era we're talking about. You don't necessarily think of Big Billy D'Elia as a household name. Who was he? The man to answer that is Matt Birkbeck. Matt, congratulations on the book. It's terrific, and it's easy to see why everybody's talking about it.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate it.
So let's start with the basics. William Big Billy D'Elia. Who was he?
So Billy was the head of the Bufalino family in northeastern Pennsylvania from 1994 until he was arrested in 2006. But what makes him really special and really unique is that for almost 30 years, he had been the protege and the so-called son of Russell Bufalino, who was arguably the most important and influential organized crime figure of the 20th century. And Bufalino, he hailed from Pennsylvania, though he spent half of his time, if not more, in New York City. And it was through Russell where Billy became this heavyweight himself within organized crime circles. And as we detail in the book, you could see the power and breadth of the Bufalino family, from everything from the Teamsters Union to the making of The Godfather to Russell, and then handing it off to Billy, becoming the so-called mob's negotiator. So they were very, very powerful individuals.
All right. And what do we know about the Bufalino crime family? I think a lot of us, which I'm going to ask you about in a minute, a lot of us have probably seen The Irishman and seeing the depiction of some figures within the Bufalino crime family in that picture. I understand that's fiction, not necessarily reality. What do we know about them? When did they operate and where did they operate? What was sort of their heyday and where was their sphere of influence?
So their beginnings were actually at the turn of the previous century, early 1900s. Italian immigrants that came over from Sicily. Thousands came from there. Many stopped in New York, others kept going. And they went to places like Detroit, Buffalo, and others went to Pittston, Pennsylvania, which is between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. And they became, over the course of time, they became a very powerful group. It wasn't until the 1940s when Russell was born in 1903, and he actually grew up in Buffalo, and he was trained within the Buffalo family, the Magadino family. But by the 1940s, he was very influential and had become the head of his own family. He had taken it over. And that's when he really started to become powerful, because it was through his relationship with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters, as well as placing his cousin, William Bufalino, there as, and he eventually became the Teamsters General Counsel. That's when Russell's power really grew. And then well into the 50s, Russell had pieces or had ownership of casinos. In Cuba, he knew the Cuban dictator well, Fulgencio Batista. He even protected his children when he was under Russell's protection, where Batista's children came to Pennsylvania for the summers. And then Russell, by 1962, the government Senate committee identified Russell as being one of the most powerful and violent members of organized crime in the country. And so by 1960, he had already become one of the most powerful figures in the U.S. And then later on, we see Russell, as you read the book, we see him in terms of his influence just in a number of different things. And what's unique about Russell is that he kept it all low key and basically out of view. The government knew about him, but the government focused on gangsters in the big cities, in New York and in Chicago, and in Detroit, and then even down in New Orleans. All the really big names: Carlos Marcello, Carlos Gambino, and then later on, people like John Gotti. The government focused on them, and Russell was there, and they were very, very well aware of Russell. But he kept a very, very low profile, and particularly when it came to the press, and didn't live in an ostentatious house. He lived in a ranch-style house in Pennsylvania. So he low-keyed it, and that's pretty much one of the reasons why people just really aren't that well aware of him.
So let's talk about Big Billy D'Elia. How did he get involved with Russell Bufalino, and how did he get involved with the mob, and how did he rise to become the head of the Bufalino family? So
Billy was this is the mid-1960s. Billy was living in Pittston, Pennsylvania, and he was a student. He was a business student, and he was in the Army Reserves, and he had a job at an appliance store, and he installed an 8-track cartridge into Russell Bufalino's car and was asked to deliver it to him. And when Billy is a big guy, he's like 6'4", 6'5", and when he arrived and dropped off the car, Russell was already aware of him. Billy's sister had married the son of Dave Ostico, who was Bufalino's underboss. And so Russell was kind of aware of him, and I guess this was kind of like a meeting for Russell. He wanted to see what he was about. And Bill, who had issues with his own father, when he met Russell, he immediately liked him. And then Russell said, "Come back tomorrow." And Billy came back the next day. And that was it. They were together. They were side by side for the next 28 years or so until Russell died in 1994. And Russell didn't have any children of his own, him and his wife. And so they, basically adopted him. Within months, Russell started introducing him as his boy. Within a year, he began introducing Billy as his son. And when you get an introduction like that, as being the son of Russell Bufalino, that just opened up so many doors. So for Billy, his story was really, it was two parts. The first part of it was as of an observer. The first 15 years or so where he's with Russell, where he was his driver. He was with him everywhere. He was with him in Pennsylvania. He was with him in New York, as you see different scenes in the book. He's in Florida with him, in Philadelphia, and he's watching, and he's seeing. He's like a fly on the wall. But he's involved in so many different interesting points of Russell's life, from the making of The Godfather, where Russell was a huge influence, to Jimmy Hoffa, and finally what happened to Jimmy Hoffa and his disappearance. It wasn't until Russell went to prison in the late 1970s where Billy became a power himself. Where the government thought that someone else was running the family for the Bufalinos, it was actually Billy. Russell had that much trust in him. And Billy, from the late 1970s and through the 1980s, he was sort of the de facto head of the family. And it was when Russell died in 1904 that he actually became the head, the recognized head of the Bufalino family.
So he benefited, at least in part, from a sort of adopted nepotism within Mafia circles, but it seems like the introductions that Russell made helped him build those relationships, which helped him become the boss, right? Is that fair?
Correct. And even when Billy was made, it was in such a way where, as Billy describes in the book, Billy was half Irish, so technically he couldn't be made. But because Russell was Russell and was the power that he was, there's a scene in the book where it was the early 1970s, and they have this gathering at a hotel in Pennsylvania, and some of the most important organized crime figures in the country are there. And Billy doesn't know anything about it, and he's led into this room, and they're all there. And Russell says, Billy is my son, and now he's one of us. And that was it. And, Russell decreed it, and Billy was made.
His 12-year reign as the boss of the Bufalino crime family, that's pretty lengthy, isn't it? I mean, at a time and in a career, being boss of a mafia family where you usually end up dead or in prison, 12 years, I have to think, is pretty substantial.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although Russell was the head of his family for decades. But Billy was smart. He got involved with folks in Philadelphia. He left New York. Russell had a lot of business in New York, and Billy, because of all the prosecutions in the 1980s and early 1990s, Billy was good friends with John Gotti and several of Gotti's senior people. And Bill decided to move some of his business to Philadelphia. But in Philadelphia, he was advising John Stanfa, the head of the family there. And he also knew Joey Merlino really well. And it was Merlino and Stanfa that were at each other's throats. And, Stanfa wanted Bill to take over his family when Stanfa was going to prison. And Bill said no, because he knew they would put a target on his back. And there are other instances where Bill learned from Russell. He learned to low-key it, to stay out of the limelight. And he had never been arrested before. It wasn't until 2006 when he was arrested in a money laundering sting. And when there were a couple of informants, people that he knew that were cooperating with the government. But Bill learned to keep it under the radar, and that's what pretty much helped him all those years.
I alluded to The Irishman. Obviously, Joe Pesci plays the character of Russell Bufalino. What did you think of The Irishman from the perspective of both historical accuracy and for Pesci's depiction of Bufalino? Even if the events aren't necessarily true, did Pesci's portrayal of Bufalino ring true?
So it was similar, but it was that movie that was the reason why Bill D'Elia eventually reached out to me. He had seen the movie. Bill knew Frank Sheeran very well, going back to the 1970s. And Frank Sheeran was important to Russell, but mostly as muscle and mostly as a hitman. As I described describe in the book, he knew him in the 70s, and then when Frank Sheeran got out of prison in the 1990s, and he tells Bill that he wants to write a book, Billy tells him flat out, fine, you want to do a book, but don't write about anyone that's still alive, and do not publish the book until Carrie Bufalino passes away. And Sharon agreed to it. And then as Frank was writing the book, he would send Billy chapters, and Billy actually gave me copies of those chapters. So when The Irishman eventually comes out, it's completely different from what the original chapters were. And I don't think Bill read the book that I Heard You Paint Houses that came out in 2004, which was Sharon's book. But Billy was upset over a couple of things. One, how they portrayed Russell in the film as being, he thought he was seen as his power wasn't, or his influence wasn't necessarily appreciated or respected. He was more of an underling, I guess, to the Angelo Bruno. I think that was Harvey Keitel who played him in the film.
Right.
So, Pesci was fine. He did a good job, but it was really more about the historical accuracy of the film. And Frank said, Frank said it was fiction. He said, not Frank, I'm sorry, Bill. Bill said it was fiction. He said Frank Sheeran did not kill Jimmy Hoffa. That never happened. Bill knew what happened. And, it was a year later when he had an associate of his reach out to me and asked if I wanted to meet with him. And that's when Bill wanted to tell his story, which is what we did in the life we chose.
So good, so good, so good.
Great brands, great prices. Everyone's got a reason to rack.
You know they have Marc Jacobs?
Nike? Yes.
Just so many good brands.
Vince, Birkenstock, and more brands you love are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
Tell me about Jimmy Hoffa. If Frank Sheeran didn't kill Jimmy Hoffa as depicted in that film, The Irishman, what do we know about Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, and what's Bill D'Elia's perspective on it?
So we don't know who actually pulled the trigger, but what we do know now is basically confirming what the government had believed very, very early on, right after Hoffa disappeared. And that was the involvement of Tony Provenzano and Tony Salerno, as well as Russell Bufalino. So Bill tells the story where several days after Hoffa disappears, Russell Bufalino and Frank Sheeran return with their wives from Detroit, where they attended the wedding of William Bufalino's daughter. And it was a few days after the wedding, after Bufalino returned, he tells Bill, drive me to New York. And on the way in, he says, listen, we're going to go meet at there's this restaurant that Russell owned called the Vesuvio. We're going to meet at the Vesuvio with Tony Provenzano and Tony Salerno and Frank Sheeran. So it was Tony Provenzano and Tony Salerno who ordered Hoffa's murder. And Frank Sheeran knew it and wanted to kill them. And the meeting was being held for Frank Sheeran to promise the other two men that he would not harm them. And so what I asked Bill, though, was Russell's involvement. Because I had written previously, I did another book 10 years ago in Bufalino, in which he had been outed in June of 1975 as having been recruited by the CIA in these so-called CIA Mafia plots, in which the CIA enlisted several members of organized crime to kill Fidel Castro, as well as provide surveillance of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Time magazine reported in June of 75 that they had outed Russell. They had said that he was part of these plots, and Russell's name had never, ever been associated with that before. The other people that were part of that included Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was to go between the CIA and Russell, as well as Sam Giancana, and a couple of other people. And it was within, a week later, Sam Giancana was scheduled to testify before the Senate committee, the Church Committee, regarding these CIA Mafia plots, and he was murdered. And it was a few weeks later that Hoffa disappeared. So I had written back then that Russell was involved. I had asked Bill about Russell's involvement. Bill loved Russell. I mean, just completely devoted to him. And his initial answer was no. I said, Bill, would Provenzano and Salerno have given that order to kill Jimmy Hoffa without Russell's okay? And he said no. So Russell was involved. And then he said yes. So we know who ordered it. We don't know who actually pulled the trigger.
And as far as the why goes, is the kind of the standard interpretation of, well, let me just ask that, what was the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of why Bufalino made that decision to give the go-ahead and murdering one of the most famous labor leaders in American history?
He had been very, very close with Hoffa. Very close. The two men loved each other, and he protected Hoffa. In the years after Hoffa got out of prison, Hoffa wanted his union back. Only under Frank Fitzsimmons, the folks like Provenzano and Salerno, who had Teamster loans under Frank Fitzsimmons, they weren't paying them back. Under Fitzsimmons, something like 37% of these loans from the Central States Pension Fund, for instance, were not being paid back. And under Hoffa, they were all paid back. And so they did not want Hoffa coming back. They would have killed Jimmy Hoffa a year or two earlier, but it was Bufalino that protected him. And it wasn't until this church committee had started that was investigating, in part, the CIA's ties to organized crime. And then Russell being outed. And I even write in the book, it was a former CIA agent that leaked Russell's participation to the Time magazine as well as to a newspaper on the West Coast. And when Russell saw that his name there in print, and he was even questioned about it by the media back then, and he of course denied it, but it really unsettled him. And at the end of the day, it was, these other witnesses had to go, these other people, these other folks that were part of it had to go. That was the straw that broke the camel's back when that Time magazine article appeared naming Russell. And so that's what prompted Russell to say, okay, fine. I can't protect.
I played that Hyman Roth clip where Hyman Roth uses that phrase, "the life we chose." That is the title of your book. Why the title? Why did you adopt that Hyman Roth axiom for the book?
Well, we actually had another title, and which we weren't really fond of, and it was Bill's daughter that came up with that. She just texted me one night and said, "What do you think of this?" And I said, "That's great." And it didn't ring a bell. Eventually it did with the line in the movie, in The Godfather 2 from Hyman Roth. Eventually it did, much later on, but it actually settled in. I thought about it, and we liked it. Mentioned it to the publisher. They liked it. It worked. It worked in so many different ways, for marketing and for the cover. But it also, basically, it was just so true because Billy chose that life. He wasn't, unlike many others that are involved in that life, Billy wasn't born into it. He chose it. And what's interesting is that at the end of the day, so many years later, and despite the fact that he went to prison for 4 years and left pretty much broke, he wouldn't change a thing. He doesn't have any regrets regarding his decision. He could have done so many other things. He could have been so many other things, but this is what he chose, and at the end of the day, he's fine with it.
Speaking of The Godfather, what role did the Bufalino crime family have play in the making of The Godfather? There's been a lot of things written, even a whole series made about the influence of La Cosa Nostra in the production of that picture. What did the Bufalino crime family specifically do?
So Billy explained it because Billy was there, and that was what was so great about talking to someone like Bill, because you're talking with an actual eyewitness. And so that's what makes it, there was a writer in Philadelphia, George Anastasia. He's one of the great mob writers in this country, and he's retired now, but he had read the book, and when he got back to us, he said, "Matt, this is historical." And he's right, because you've got someone like Billy D'Elia who was actually there and relaying the actual story. It's not second, third-hand information. Bill described, we had heard before about Russell's participation and influence in that movie, but Billy really gave us a vivid description of how Russell was influential in the actual and participated in the movie being the production getting the green light. They did not want it to be made for a number of different reasons, and as I explained in the book, and there was a lot of violence involved. But when they came to an agreement, and it was Joe Colombo, but it was also Joe Colombo with Russell advising him. And then once it was made, Billy describes how he's in Pennsylvania at one of Russell's dress manufacturing shops, and the phone rings, and he picks it up. And the voice on the other end says, "It's Marlon Brando for Russell Bufalino." And Billy thinks it's a joke, and he turns to Russell and says, "There's some guy on the phone, says he's Marlon Brando." And Russell says, "Give me that phone." And it was Marlon Brando. And Marlon Brando needed someone to help coach him on how to become a Don. And it was Russell that did it. And they met a number of different times. So
wow.
The portrayal that you see on film is, for all intents and purposes, Marlon Brando portraying Russell Bufalino.
That's incredible. I had no idea. Do we know if after the production of that film, the Brando-Bufalino relationship continued, or did it end when the production of the film ended?
It ended. Russell didn't like him. As I explained in the book, he thought that Brando thought he was, during their meetings, and you didn't do this with Russell, he thought that Brando thought he was above him. So as Billy describes in... I'm relaying what Billy said. He thought that Brando was a punk, and they never had met again. But the actors that are in the film, Lenny Montana, who portrays Luca Brasi, who was just basically picked because he was on site. He was a member of the Colombo family, and he was with Andy Russo, who was a captain, and Andy Russo was very, very close with Russell Bufalino. And, Bill describes Lenny Montana stealing a camera lens and bringing it to a restaurant they were all at, showing it off, and Russell comes out and learns about it and screams at him and tells him to turn around and bring it back. Bill describes how James Caan had basically lived with them for weeks during the filming of The Godfather. James Caan was very good friends with Andy Russo. They apparently had grown up together. And so there was a number of stories. There's pretty much a whole chapter in the book devoted to the making of The Godfather and the Bufalino family's influence in that.
We've heard a lot about the mob's involvement in the world of boxing. Obviously, I don't think any boxing match has gotten more attention than the Sonny Liston Muhammad Ali fight, where Sonny Liston essentially sits down and refuses to continue the fight. What involvement did either Russell Bufalino or Bill D'Elia have with Muhammad Ali, either on a personal level or anything beyond that?
So there's a scene in the book where Russell's about to go to prison for a second time, and it's going to be a very long stretch, and he's already in his 80s. And they reach out to Muhammad Ali and his trainer, Angelo Dundee, to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with Senator Ted Kennedy to see if Kennedy can help get a pardon for Russell. And when Ali and Dundee enter Kennedy's office, and they tell Kennedy who they are there for, Kennedy throws them out of the office. And that's because of Russell's relationship with the Kennedy brothers going back to the 1950s. He and Bobby Kennedy hated each other. Russell had testified before several different committees that where Kennedy served as, Robert Kennedy served as counsel for. And they got into it, which is in the book. And they got into it, very, very heated exchanges. And then, of course, there are the assassinations of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and what people believe in terms of the mob's involvement. And so he just threw them out. But to be able to call on the former heavyweight champion of the world or an icon like Muhammad Ali to do the bidding of Russell Bufalino, I mean, to me, it spoke volumes. It was similar to when someone showed me FBI files regarding the great Johnny Unitas and how he drove up in the early 1970s to meet with Russell from Baltimore. And he came up and he had lunch with Russell and then drove around the Wilkes-Barre Scranton area and met with other people.
So talk to folks about that. Johnny Unitas, one of the most Hall of Fame quarterback, 3-time MVP, a legend, especially in Baltimore. Why would Johnny Unitas, at the top of his game, really need to go and pay tribute to Russell Bufalino? What was Unitas going to get out of that, or was it sort of just just fascination on the part of Unitas?
No, they knew each other, and apparently, according to Bill. Now, again, I'm asking Bill D'Elia, and I spoke to him for almost 2 years. I mean, I still speak to him now, but for the purpose of the book, I spoke to him for almost 2 years, and you're trying to get him to remember events from 50 years ago. And so, when talking about Johnny Unitas, he recalls that they had brought him up to appear at some events that they were involved in. But Johnny Unitas, there was always this side talk about him being involved in gambling, and it was some issue that he did get involved in. It was a business, some kind of a gambling business, in the late 70s after he retired. But as an active player in the NFL, you're not supposed to be meeting with a mafia boss like Russell Bufalino or being close to anyone involved in gambling. Russell had immense influence, within gambling throughout the Northeast, and had, the FBI agents that were surveilling Bufalino at the time, and when they saw Johnny Unitas walk into this restaurant to meet with him, they were floored. So it's just again, Johnny Unitas, Muhammad Ali. There were a number of other folks that you'll read in the book that, even Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, Russell goes into a restaurant, Jilly's, in the city, and with Bill, and they go sit at a table in the back, and they're told that that's Frank's table, Frank Sinatra's table. And Russell says, I don't care whose table it is. If he comes in, you tell me he can come sit with me. And that's what happened. Frank Sinatra came in and paid deference to Russell Bufalino. There's actually a picture of them together in the book.
I see that. It's really neat. And the Sinatra Bufalino relationship, did that continue?
I'm sure that they were in touch. How often they saw each other, I can't say. I mean, we talked about, you see Russell with Sinatra in the early 70s. You see Russell with Sinatra in the mid-70s when they took that photo with Andy Russo and several other people. They knew each other. They knew each other well. Bill was there that night in 1972 when he met him. And they had, Russell, and he said Russell and Sinatra were talking as if they were old friends, and they probably were. So I have no doubt that continued.
And by the way, I do want to mention, in addition to this book, if people are interested in Russell Bufalino and your work on Russell Bufalino specifically, they can check out one of your previous books, The Quiet Don, The Untold Story of Media Kingpin Russell Bufalino. And I haven't read that one yet, but it's certainly been very popularly acclaimed, and a lot of people are into it. Now, when you think of entertainers that might be friends with mob figures, I don't think the name Frank Sinatra would surprise many people. A name that probably would surprise a lot of listeners is the name of Michael Jackson. But Michael Jackson had a relationship with Russell as well.
Well, actually, he had the relationship with Billy D'Elia.
No, with Billy, sorry.
Yeah, it
back
was.
And forth between
but that
Russell
came from another name that floored me when Billy mentioned it. And it just, we were just talking, and it just rolled out. And that was Donald Trump. And, Billy talks about meeting with Trump in the early... Billy did a lot of business in Atlantic City. So he was there back and forth. And so he got to know Trump. And so Trump had just opened the Trump Plaza, I think it was. And he, a few years later, he had leased some property from these two brothers from Philadelphia for a parking lot. And he was supposed to pay them, I think it was $7 million. He was going to buy it. Only when they were going to close the deal, Trump tells him, I'm only going to pay you $6 million.
So now the brothers are like, well, you still owe us another $1 million. Trump wasn't going to pay it, so the brothers are like, what are we going to do? So they all agreed to a coin flip, and Trump won. So he saved $1 million. It was a few years later, a year later, I'm sorry, in 1988, where Billy, he's now known as the mob's negotiator. He's in New York, he goes to California, he's going everywhere in between. He's being called on to handle issues, not just with organized crime. It could be business, it could be entertainment, it could be sports. In this case, he gets a call, and he's told that Donald Trump had enlisted or tried to get Michael Jackson to perform in Atlantic City. Only Jackson's manager, Frank DeLeo, who you may know or recall from Goodfellas, he portrayed the cab stand owner Tootie, the squad fellow, and Frank DeLeo said, no, Jackson doesn't play casinos. So not taking no for an answer, Trump enlists two mob heavyweights. One of them is Mike Rizzatelli from Los Angeles, and offers them $1 million if they can get Jackson to perform in Atlantic City. And they threaten DeLeo, and DeLeo reaches out to Pittsburgh, where he knows people, but they tell him, look, we're not big enough to get involved in this. Let's call Billy D'Elia. And they call Billy. And there was this big meeting in New York during the Grammys of 1988 at the Helmsley Palace. And Rizzatelli and this other guy show up, this guy named Little Harry. And they come in, they start screaming and yelling, we're taking over, blah, blah, blah. And then they see Billy there, and they realize that's it, it's over. Gig is up. And they say, Bill, please, let's do this. We'll give you half the $1 million that Trump offered us. And Bill says no. And they leave dejected. And then Frank DeLeo is ecstatic, only Bill turns to him and says, it's not over yet. I'm now your partner. And so from then on, Billy D'Elia becomes Michael Jackson's co-manager for the next 2 years.
Wow.
And he went on tour with Jackson. There's a photograph of them together in the book. He went on tour with him that year. It was the Bad Tour. It was a huge tour. He spent a lot of time with him. He counseled him. Jackson would complain about his own father and the issues he had with him. So they did get kind of close during that tour. And then that ended a couple of years later. When I believe it was David Geffen that stepped in. But to me, it was just, this is a point where now Billy's memory is going, and he's feeling, it took a long time for Bill to feel comfortable in talking to me, because I'm the first journalist he's ever spoken with. And, once he got past that, and once he started to trust me, then the story started to roll. And this was one of the ones that really kind of caught my attention.
That is wild. Absolutely. Would certainly catch my attention as well. Going back to Donald Trump, obviously, Donald Trump has been associated, especially in the 80s, early 80s, with late 70s, with Roy Cohn, an attorney he still talks about in very, very fond terms. And a lot of the attorneys that he seems to go through now as president and as a former president, he seems to constantly unfavorably compare to Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, also mentioned prominently in your book, was, in addition to being Trump's lawyer and sort of a political fixer, former prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, also was somebody that represented a lot of mafia figures. What was Russell's relationship with Roy Cohn? What was Billy's relationship with Roy Cohn?
So Russell knew Roy Cohn, but they really, I'm not going to say got close, but they actually hired him when Russell, again, when he was about to go to prison in 1981 or 82, they brought Cohn in to represent him to file an appeal. And Cohn agreed to do it. And Billy describes, some of it's actually pretty funny too. He describes having to go to New York and, pay Cohn cash, and he gave him envelopes with $10,000 in it. And then there was this one scene where he meets him in Pennsylvania in the Poconos, where Cohn had a home there, and apparently was throwing some kind of wild party. But Cohn and Trump obviously knew each other well. Trump's relationship with organized crime, that's no secret, in that as a builder in New York in the 70s and 80s, and even with his father, you had to deal with the mob, given that they controlled the unions. So it was pretty much the lay of the land there. I think what's really interesting, though, is that in the 90s, so Trump and Billy's, their dealings continued past the 1980s into the 90s, when Billy's now the recognized head of the Bufalino family. And, a couple of scenes in the book where they're looking to do deals together. One of them is selling phone cards with the Taj Mahal on one side. These were cards that people would buy, and they would use them to call mainly overseas. You get them, like, you pay $20 for one or something like that. And they were going to do a deal together using Taj Mahal, only Trump wanted a lot of cash up front, and he wanted it delivered directly to him. No lawyers, no nothing. So he's actually doing business with the head of the Bufalino family, and he knows who Bill is. Bill didn't want to pay him that kind of money up front, so then they talked about doing this timeshare deal together, in which people will go to Atlantic City for a 2-3 day vacation, and they'd have to go to this presentation, and at these 2-3 hour presentations, you would get gifts. And Trump wanted one of the gifts to be his book, The Art of the Deal. Only Bill had to buy the books at full price in advance, which would have cost him 6 figures. He didn't want to do it. The benefit for Trump would have been that when you buy that many books, you're talking about 5,000 copies, maybe even more, his book rockets up the bestseller list.
Sure.
And he knew that. So, but Bill did not want to, he didn't trust Trump, and so he didn't want to fork over that kind of money. In each case, it would have been easy 6 figures. So neither deal got done. But I think this is really the first documented, these are the first documented cases where Trump was actually meeting with the head of a crime family. And to me, that's what, that's the most important part of what you get out of these meetings, with Trump. So, who basically feels comfortable doing business with anyone.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
I want to come back to Trump in just a moment because that's pretty interesting. But just going back in history a little bit, the Bay of Pigs, it's now well documented that the CIA and the mob worked together on a number of different things, not just related to Cuba, but related to World War II, all sorts of things, attempted assassinations, all sorts of other things. What do we know about the mob's involvement with the CIA with respect to the Bay of Pigs? What did they do, and who sort of arranged this marriage between the CIA and the mob?
So the CIA was this rogue agency back then with really no oversight. So they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. And they were frustrated with what was going on in Cuba. So they came up with the bright idea, given that the mob lost its casinos. The casinos were a cash cow, as well as the other businesses organized crime had in Cuba. And Russell had interests in a couple of casinos down there, along with other legitimate businesses. And when he fled when Castro took over, and he left behind almost $1 million buried. And the CIA got wind of that story. So they reached out to Hoffa, who was the intermediary, to see if Russell would help them, particularly with the Bay of Pigs invasion. They were looking for surveillance. And I had written about this in my previous book, The Quiet Dawn, about Russell being on a boat off the coast of Cuba with 2 CIA agents, but Billy confirmed it. Russell had talked about it with Bill and with others, and apparently it became a joke over the course of time with members of the Bufalino family, where they would go to Russell, "Hey, when are we going to Cuba to go get that money? The $1 million or so." So they had used members of organized crime. It wasn't the smartest thing to do in retrospect. It didn't really benefit them in any way. But they did use them, and for Russell, he just as a sidebar, when he saw that Castro could win, he flipped sides. Actually, he was working both sides. He was shipping arms to Castro, so he thought that by doing that, Castro would let him stay. But that didn't happen. He had to flee, and he had to get out of there really quick. So that was all true. It was all accurate. Billy confirmed it, and it's in the book.
I spoke recently with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and we got into both his uncle's assassination and his father's assassination. And one of the things that he pointed to was this marriage between the Mafia and the CIA. And he believes there's a strong likelihood that the Mafia and the CIA, and at least elements within the CIA, played a role in President Kennedy's assassination, but certainly in the cover-up of the assassination. What is Bill D'Elia's view of that whole thing, the Kennedy assassinations? You already said the hostility that existed between Russell and Robert Kennedy. It doesn't seem like much of a stretch to think that could extend to John as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of animosity, and I did ask Bill about the Kennedy assassinations. And, he had confirmed that it wasn't just a lone shooter. But I didn't get into it in the book. I just didn't want to. I had such a great story as it was. I didn't really want. There was so much that's been written about the Kennedy assassination.
Sure.
And for Bill, he wasn't there. This is kind of real secondhand info, which I don't have a problem with. Don't get me wrong, but I just didn't want people to look at this and say,
right.
They'll immediately dismiss it. Some may take it, oh, okay, that's interesting, and others would dismiss it. And, Billy has his ideas on who the other shooters were based on what he had learned and what he was told, but it wasn't, it's not anything that other people haven't said in the past. And these are names that I recognized before. But it was clearly, I've always personally just going through, spending, I'm not a mob writer. I'm not an organized crime writer. I said after I did The Quiet Dawn, I wasn't going to do another mob book, but I knew how important Billy D'Elia was. And I just, as a journalist, I just jumped into it, and I got my taste of doing it when I did my Sammy Davis Jr. book back in 2008, because I had no idea that Sammy had been run by the mob for so many years. But, I had going through all these different FBI files and all my research and all my study over 10 years or so, I'm convinced it was clearly a conspiracy, and that the mob was involved and the CIA was involved, and it was a huge cover-up. And even to this day, they won't release all the information on the Kennedy assassination. But because of that and all the continued discussion, I did not want to include.
Sure, makes sense.
I didn't want to include any of it in this book. I just thought it was just too interesting and too fascinating. I just didn't want to take away from it.
What is William D'Elia doing today?
He is retired. He's around 76, 77 years old. He lives with his wife. He's got 3 children. They're all professionals. He's got grandchildren. He has a summer home that he's had since the early 1980s that he spends his summers at, mostly weekends and whatnot. That's it. He's a grandfather, and he's enjoying his grandkids. And when you talk to him, you could see, and he talks about the old days. You can still see there's this kind of like sparkle in his eye. He misses it. He misses, I guess, what you'd call, quote unquote, the action of that life. It was a dangerous life, and it was a violent life. Don't get me wrong. These were, he knows what he was. These were gangsters, and while there was a lot of violence, the one thing I did learn is that it was really about business. The world wasn't, and I've said this repeatedly since the book came out, I always thought the world was black and white with a little gray. But after spending 2 years with Bill, you see that there's a lot of gray, and there are people like Billy that are in there. Just people need him. There are businesses and people, sports figures, entertainers. There were stories in the book about people like Fabio and others who got into trouble, and they need people like Billy D'Elia to extricate themselves. It's not just organized crime, and it's this whole world that exists that 99% of people just never get a look at or never get a window into to see it. And so, to me, this book is, it opens up that window.
You mentioned that Billy never trusted Donald Trump, not in their dealings, not in Atlantic City. I'm curious as to his view of Trump today, not necessarily Trump as a person or his character, but as a political figure. It's certainly we've seen people like Skinny Joe Merlino say positive things about Trump as a political figure, even if they didn't necessarily have the best dealings with him in the business world.
Now, Billy said this. He said that he's the same. He hasn't changed at all. He's, and this is Billy saying this, from his dealings with him back in the 80s and 90s. He didn't trust him then, and he doesn't trust him today.
Why did Bill agree to talk to you for this book? Obviously, I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of Omerta and the Mafia being a secret society, and that unless you make the decision to cooperate, you take a lot of these stories to your grave. Why would an old school gangster like Billy D'Elia agree to talk to you?
That's a good question, because that's the one I still couldn't figure it out like 3-4 months into the project. But he did not. There were a couple of reasons. One, he truly did not like the portrayal of Russell Bufalino in The Irishman. Like I told you, he loved Russell, much more than his own father. He had a very difficult time with his own father growing up. And to me, that's another reason why he kind of turned towards Russell. But he did not like it. The other one was because he had been, when he went to prison, or before he went to prison, he had testified before a grand jury, but it had to do with a local guy who was actually a billionaire and had gotten a license for a casino in Pennsylvania, which is a whole other story. But Billy had known this fellow for 30, 40 years, and the fellow lied about knowing Billy when he was going for his gaming license. And so when Billy got arrested, he had to testify before a grand jury about this that was investigating this guy. And they already had the goods on this guy. They had video of Billy meeting with him. They had paperwork. They had recordings. So Billy wasn't going to lie on the stand. So when they would ask him questions like, "Do you know him?" Blah blah blah. He said, "Yes, yes, yes." He was labeled for lack of a better term, a rat, and Billy wasn't. And to this day maintains that he did not discuss anything else. As you read in the book, and at the very beginning, when he got arrested, every major law enforcement agency in the country wanted to talk to him. FBI, Secret Service, Homeland Security, New York City Terrorism Task Force, because they all wanted to. They knew he knew a lot. The FBI wanted to talk to him about Hoffa, and they met with him like 2-3 times, and he refused to say anything to anyone. And it wasn't until he reached out to me to tell me his story. But even then, you talk about, a murder and all of that. He was fine talking about Russell, but when it came to actually telling details of other things that he was involved with, he was very tight-lipped. And it took months before he felt comfortable telling these stories. Even to this day, he's very, very cognizant of the fact that he does not want to be seen as someone who was, a so-called informant or whatnot.
Right.
And he wasn't. But that was pretty important to him. But he just, he finally felt comfortable to tell his story. But he also didn't want to give any information that would get anyone arrested, and he didn't. And he did not want to talk about violence. There's violence in the book. But he's fearful that the government would still come back and perhaps
sure,
try to arrest him on some other charges.
I'm going to let you go. I'm going to let you go in a minute. I just have to ask you this. What is the state of the American Mafia today, and what's the state of what was the Bufalino crime family today specifically?
So the broader Mafia families are nothing like they were back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. I think the government did a number on them all in terms of all their RICO investigations and whatnot. They're still around. They're still involved in a number of different things, but not to the level that they used to be. Bufalino families, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much gone. There's still some things I'm sure going on up there. It's nothing that is even close to what Billy D'Elia had been in charge of back in the 90s or even in the early 2000s. I guess, maybe a number of small-time associates are still floating around there, like they are probably in every other city. But it's not, this is a window in, my book, Life We Chose, is a window into a number of things, but it's also a window into the decline of organized crime, the Italian Mafia in this country. And don't forget, there are also other groups, other gangs now. You got the Russian mob in Brooklyn, in Sheepshead Bay, for instance. You got Asian groups, you got the Latin groups now who are taking over and doing things with drugs and whatnot. But it's not even remotely close to what it used to be as far as it relates to the Italian mob.
Final question, and I appreciate you being so generous with your time, Matt, and I hope people do check out The Life We Chose. We're going to link to it in our description of this podcast. If The Irishman is not the most accurate version of the events and the figures that you write about here, people like Tony Salerno, people like Russell Bufalino, even others that we haven't spent as much time talking about, folks like Albert Anastasia, John Gotti, Joe Colombo, what would you say is the most accurate motion picture regarding any or all of these figures? If someone's looking for a really realistic mafia film that is true history, for lack of a better term, where would you steer them?
I will tell you what Billy D'Elia told me. So I asked him that same question, and he said Goodfellas.
Really?
Yeah. He said, The Godfather he loved. What was funny, though, is that despite all of his influence and participation with the making of The Godfather, Russell Bufalino never saw the film. He never wanted to see it. Even after the producer, Al Ruddy, offered him his own private showing, Russell never wanted to see it. But when it came to Goodfellas, that was clearly, according to Billy, the one film that really reflected what it was like to live that kind of life.
Yeah, I should mention the gentleman that wrote the source material for Goodfellas and then wrote Goodfellas himself, one of the best writers of all time, Nicholas Pileggi, has a terrific blurb for your book. He calls The Life We Chose an unforgettable story and a really great read. And I don't think anybody that picks up this book is going to dispute Nicholas Pileggi on that. Matt, thanks so much for the time. Best of luck with the book. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Frank.
If you were sent this podcast by someone else, do us a favor and share it with folks that you think will enjoy interesting stories. Do us a favor further and subscribe to this podcast. You can search The Racket Report on any podcast platform. If you have feedback, you can certainly email me, frank.morano, that's frank.morano, at wabcradio.com. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.